And it made it to where my husband and I weren't really sure that we wanted to have a second child because we feared that we'd have another child with these same issues. But we did. And then my daughter does not have those same issues, but she was 2 weeks old when they did routine newborn screening, and she was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. And just for people who don't know, cystic fibrosis is a genetic disease that primarily impacts the lungs and pancreas. There's a protein, the CFTR protein, that regulates salt movements in and out of your cells. And this keeps your mucuses at a good consistency. But with people who have CF, those proteins don't work properly. And so you end up with abnormally thick and sticky mucuses throughout the body. And so in the lungs, the job of mucus is to actually move things out that shouldn't be in there. So things like dead cells, spent DNA, bacteria, your mucus will move those things out. But if you can imagine your mucus is really thick and sticky, that then becomes a wonderful breeding ground for bacteria.
Yeah.
And so for you and I, when we get illnesses, we can clear those using our own immune responses, but my daughter can't do that. So she frequently takes antibiotics. And that was kind of a hard part about learning to accept her disease, is that because we know all this information about the side effects of antibiotics, but they really are a necessary part of her treatment. So that's how, and then, as you can imagine, I have these two kids with these different issues, but I wanted to find some type of way that I could better support them. And I think a lot of the motivation, honestly, came out of desperation and this feeling of hopelessness and some of the things that you just described, of feeling like you're really out of control and that you've just been dealt this thing that, what are you going to do with it? And so I just really wanted to find a solution. And I do have a background in research. I've worked in academia in varying settings as a researcher in different labs, and ended up just using that skill set to look at diet and how I might be able to support my kids. And one of the things that I learned that stood out as being the most important factor in supporting them is that about 85% of your immune response originates in your gut. And so if you think about allergies and asthma, the symptoms that we were seeing in my son, this is an out of control immune response. His immune response was faulty. And then you think about my daughter really needing to have this strong immunity so that she can fight these infections, but that she's also having to take all these antibiotics that are going to be constantly wiping out that beneficial bacteria population. I wanted to focus on gut health as a way to help my children. And that's when I focused on the GAPS diet, which is gut and psychology syndrome. I'm guessing you've heard of this diet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've actually had a podcast episode on it with Kara from Health, Home, and Happiness. She's another parent, and she actually specializes a lot in GAPS diet. I think that was episode 4 for anybody who wants to go back and check that out. But you can go ahead and give us a little intro about what GAPS is.
The GAPS diet was developed by Natasha Campbell McBride, and she worked with kids specifically who have autism, spectrum disorder, schizophrenia, all of these different psychological issues. And what she saw is that these kids that had these psychological problems, that oftentimes they also had digestive distress and other issues. So she hypothesized that these issues were originating in the gut, and that if you could heal the gut, you could heal these other symptoms and issues that these kids were having. And so she developed the GAPS diet, which I won't go into the details of what that is just because it's kind of extensive.
Yeah.
But she developed that diet as a way to treat these problems in kids. But the reason that it stood out to me as being beneficial is because she was focusing on gut health. And so I used a lot of the principles of the GAPS diet in introducing solids to my daughter. The thing that we did that was different, we actually did 2 main things that were different. For one, GAPS, they do promote the use of raw fermented dairy. And because my son had problems with dairy in the past, and for him, it just felt like dairy did not make sense. It felt like it was an inflammatory food and that it was best that he needed to avoid that for a few years. And then also for my daughter, we avoided it because dairy is a mucus-producing food. Chinese medicine teaches you that different foods can be mucus-producing, and dairy is one of those foods. And so for my daughter, it made sense to avoid it, given the fact that she had cystic fibrosis. But other than that, we started following, these principles of the GAPS diet, which snowballed into this grain-free, dairy-free, sugar-free diet. And we stuck with it pretty strictly for about 3 years. And that's what I ended up writing this book about, is how to implement this diet in a way that doesn't also make you lose your mind.
Yeah. So before we go into that, are you guys still following that diet? Are you a little bit more lax now, or?
We are definitely a little bit more lax. And it's been for a couple of reasons. One is that I think that we experienced most of the benefits that we're going to get from this diet. My son has improved by leaps and bounds. So he used to have this whole list of allergies, and now he's down to just wheat and barley. And he is very allergic to those things. I mean, he's allergic to wheat like people are allergic to peanuts. And because of the severity of his allergy, I mean, we rarely eat out. We eat out. We have 2 restaurants we go to, and we go there about twice a year, just because it's not worth the risk. It doesn't feel very safe for him. And he also used to have all these sensitivities, things that caused rashes and digestive distress. And I don't see those same symptoms in him anymore. He also has asthma, and we have almost entirely eliminated his daily medications. Sometimes he can entirely go off of his meds, but then sometimes he has some issues and he has to go back on them. But what we've noticed most recently is a lot of those issues are related to environmental allergens, things like mold and cats and things that are just really hard for us to control. And so I think that we experienced a lot of benefits, and I am interested in eating more grains and dairy in moderation, not very often, but using the Weston A. Price Foundation, using their practices for eating these foods. So with grains, if we're going to eat them, A, I want them to be organic, and B, I want to process them in a way that's actually digestible. So doing things like soaking, sprouting, and fermenting, and then cooking those grains. But we're not doing a lot of that. And then when we do buy dairy, it's got to be grass-fed or from animals that were pasture-raised. And ideally, I'd find raw, but I found that that's pretty challenging to find. So we do eat some pasture-raised cheese sometimes, and every now and then we do eat some grains. And but yeah, for the most part, we stick with it, like 90%, like 80 to 90%, I'd say.
That's pretty good. Yeah, with the asthma thing, my wife had lifelong, like, terrible asthma where she needed an inhaler twice a day, just, for maintenance. And then on, the bad days when it was like really cold, she would need it more, or whenever what seasons would change, or whenever the environmental allergens were high, she would have to do it more often. But then she gave up dairy, and she's been fine ever since. She hasn't had an inhaler in over 5 years. So
yeah,
I mean, it's crazy, the impact of just giving up dairy. I mean, we've gone full on paleo since, but just giving up dairy just like takes away asthma. It's crazy amazing.
Yeah.
Like, to see her and know her before she gave up dairy, and now she's like, we don't even have an inhaler in the house anymore. It's like, it's crazy. I mean, she still has times where her chest gets tight, she eats something that might have been moldy or something like that. But, she just kind of chills out, and her body kind of deals with it without needing the steroid. So it's pretty awesome.
And that's actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is one of the benefits that we've seen for my husband as well. He is very similar. He's been on asthma medication since he was about 18 months of age. And after following this diet for a full year, he was able to stop taking his meds. And for him, the problem food is actually wheat. So he doesn't notice as much of a difference from dairy. But even if every now and then he'll drink a beer or something, and then he has asthma issues again. And so for him, it has been a really beneficial thing as well. And we weren't even necessarily doing this diet for him. I mean, you know how this goes. It's like you're so focused on your kids and you think kids, got to heal the kids. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow, look at what happened to me. This is cool.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we were a little stubborn, I guess, in the beginning, because Ethan was on the diet, I don't know, 4 years. And we're just like, no, Ethan can't have that. Ethan can't have that. And we're just still, putting him to bed. And then we drive through McDonald's, or we order a pizza, while Ethan's in bed. All the kids are in bed. And meanwhile, we're getting sicker and sicker. And then finally, I'm like, I'm learning all this stuff. Why in the hell am I not applying this to the rest of us? And then we did. And now, hey, oh my goodness, we're like, my wife and I combined lost over 100 pounds, and we made the switch to paleo. And like, we had our third kid, and she's getting ready to turn 5 next month, and she's yet to have a sick visit, much less need an antibiotic. So
That's awesome.
I'm pretty proud of that.